primarily in English. And many thanks to our interpreter, Noelle, for her work. So we're here to welcome you on behalf of Labor for Palestine, who's hosting this event. Labor for Palestine is a pan-Canadian network of labor activists who work to deepen solidarity with Palestinian workers and people in their struggle for liberation. We are hosting this urgent event and having this very important discussion from directly hearing from Palestinian labor leaders and activists who are on the ground working towards their struggle for liberation from Jerusalem and the occupied territories. For the labor movement in Canada, there is certainly a significant role that we have to play in supporting Palestinian resistance and standing in solidarity with workers and people who are directly affected. Our solidarity is also all the more prescient given the Canadian government's complicity in that oppression, ethnic cleansing, and apartheid that are carried out by the State of Israel. We also want to acknowledge, Yaf and I, that we are hosting today from the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabeg people. As Palestinians and social justice activists residing in traditional territories of Indigenous people, we want to acknowledge our commitment to land back. Land back is about Indigenous people confronting colonialism at its root. It's also a way for Indigenous people to fight for the right to their relationship with the earth, and also to come back to ourselves as sovereign nations and Indigenous nations. We cannot talk about the Palestinian struggle for freedom and liberation without a full commitment to the struggle and resistance of Indigenous people here in Canada, and also without acknowledging the political prisoners and the land defenders who have and continue to be incarcerated because of their fight against settler colonialism and settler colonial policies here. I'd now like to invite Mo Al-Qassam, president of QP 1281 and a member of the Palestinian Youth Movement, to make introductory remarks. Mo, we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you, Yafa, and for the organizers of Labor for Palestine. I'll begin by giving my greetings in Arabic. تحياتي للشعب الفلسطيني في الوطن وفي الشتات. وأنا حبيت أحكي هالكلمة باللغة العربية لأنه في هالزمن العجيب والغريب حتى لغتنا مهددة بالانقراض. وخلينا ما ننسى إنه نضالنا وحركة تحريرنا الوطني لازم تضلها متضامنة مع الأسرى. بحب أوجه تحية وكل احترامي وتقديري للعمال والكادحين وكوادر التنظيم في الوطن، والسلام لأرواح كل الشهداء. So now I will speak in English. Today, more than ever, as Palestinians in the homeland and the diaspora, we're understanding our struggle to be one with the class struggle. We have always understood that our primary antagonist has been the ideology of Zionism. And throughout our history, we have learned and relearned that this struggle is underscored by multiple forms of exploitation that the Zionist forces and the forces that are in collusion with them will employ against us. Our people today in the homeland and diaspora are fighting against the comprador governments. Our people are fighting against the Zionist forces, the military of the so-called State of Israel, and the settler mobs that are attacking our people in the homeland. Historically, we've always seen that the Palestinian people and our allies utilize the forces and the power of labor to call for and organize strikes for our struggle. Most notably, we've seen that when we were under British rule and we were revolting. We've seen that throughout the intifadas and dispersed throughout the history of our struggle. And we are seeing that as of today. When we're talking about the class struggle, when we're talking about the struggle of working peoples, we're also seeing that working people across the world are in solidarity with the oppressed and decolonized. We've seen that with these strikes and with the withholding of labor in solidarity with the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. And we will continue to see more of that in solidarity with the Palestinian people. As of now, there have been calls to block arms sales and to sanction the state of Israel for its crimes against my people. Multiple organizations, institutions, and unions in Canada and across the world are emboldening that call. And we will soon see its effect. And we will see workers rising in solidarity with our people and with our just cause. And we will see the workers in Palestine, al-Ummal wal-Kadihin, revolting against a comprador government and revolting against Zionism and all its forces. Thank you very much for having me. Until liberation and return.
Thank you so much, Mo. I will wait for the host to turn my video on.
Yeah, host.
Host Kelty, can you please turn my video on?
Working on it. Keep going.
Thank you. All right, here we go. Thank you, everybody. And thank you so much, Kelty, for doing all the tech work. Thank you, Mo. And again, I am Yafa Jarrar, one of the co-hosts, along with Amy Kishik today. And now I will be introducing our speakers from Palestine. And we thank them for their time. As we know, they're all running on very little and low sleep, doing the work on the ground along with our Palestinian brothers and sisters back in Palestine. So we really thank them for their time. Today we have Mohammed al-Kurd, writer from Jerusalem's Sheikh Jarrah in occupied Palestine. We have Budur Hassan, writer and legal researcher for Jerusalem Center for Legal Aid and Human Rights. We have Riham Abu Aita, Palestinian journalist and communications expert. Riham is an active member of the Palestinian Journalists Union. And we have Jamal Jum'a, executive committee member of the Palestine New Federation of Trade Unions and secretariat member of the Boycott National Committee, the BNC. We will start with Mohammed al-Kurd, who will be speaking to us about the situation in Jerusalem and the latest, not new, vicious crimes committed by Israel against Palestinians in all of Palestine. Welcome, Mohammed al-Kurd, and thank you so much for joining us.
Ahla sahla. If I can get my camera on, that would be wonderful.
For sure.
But also we could do a podcast, you know.
There you go. Thank you, Mohammed.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much for hosting this. I won't take too much of your time. I'll speak about what's been going on in Sheikh Jarrah and in the larger context in Jerusalem and in historic Palestine. In the past 3 weeks, Sheikh Jarrah, my neighborhood, has been under an illegal blockade where no Palestinians are allowed entry, not even journalists, not even medics. Not even us who live in the neighborhood. We even have been having a hard time going to our houses. And Meanwhile, Israeli settlers can just walk in freely, no questions asked. Sheikh Jarrah has been making headlines in the past few months, and this is thanks to the many, tireless journalists and activists working on it. And it's thanks to our stubborn demand that our story get told the way it is, truthfully and objectively. And Sheikh Jarrah is a microcosm of Israeli settler colonialism everywhere in historic Palestine, because you see it manifested in land theft and house takeovers by Israeli settlers working in collusion with the Israeli state. And you also see the manifestation of police brutality and excessive force by the Israeli state. And you also see it in the apartheid system that I just explained, right? We don't get to go into our homes, we get brutalized in the street, whereas settlers not only can walk around wielding rifles and walk without having to be stopped at the cement barriers, but they also can give orders to the Israeli occupation forces to harass us and brutalize us. So that's what settler colonialism means in material terms, beyond the academic explanations of what it means. And colonialism is exactly what it sounds like. In Sheikh Jarrah, it's the fact that we have organizations working, different entities working to take over our homes. So it's very important for those of you who are listening to know that we don't distinct between the Israeli state and Israeli settlers. There is no distinction as long as they are working together to uproot us from our indigenous lands. And this has been happening all over historic Palestine. In terms of brutality, we've had over seven people killed by Israeli fire, live ammunition in the West Bank just in the past week. We've had one killed in Fahim. His name is Muhammad Kiwan. Yesterday, he had an absolutely gigantic funeral. And we see this also in the Gaza Strip, not only when people are getting carpet bombed, but just in the general status of the Gaza Strip of being home to 2 million people who are effectively in a cage. So that's the situation in terms of brutality. However, we've been seeing a lot. I don't want to exhaust my time speaking about the brutality, about the atrocities committed by Israelis and the Israeli machine, because I'm well aware that the situation at this point is not a situation of ignorance. It's rather a situation of inaction, and I'm committed to knowing that you are all wanting to help here, and I'm happy to answer your questions after. But just coming from my implied assertion that you want to help rather than learn, I'll tell you a little bit about the good strides we've been making. We've been able to shift the narrative in the mainstream globally. I think this is a fact. I've been hesitant to say this for the past few weeks, particularly because I'm pretty young. But in speaking with a lot of my friends and reading a lot about history, this is truly unprecedented. The level of support is unprecedented. And it's wonderful that we have to keep momentum going, but it's also unprecedented in the sense that these colonial barriers, these colonial fragmentations implemented for us by the colonial Israeli regime, be it the like physical barriers of the cement and the checkpoints and the wall, and also the mental barriers they've implemented for us to divide us as a people, are all getting dissolved now. And we are realizing, not even realizing, we are seeing that we are a Palestinian people despite and in spite of the colonial geography, despite and in spite the colonial fragmentations. This has
Mohammed,
manifested.
if you don't mind, just a note from the interpreter, if you could speak just a little bit more slowly. But thank you so much. I hate to interrupt. Yeah.
Of course.
Sure.
So we have seen this national unity manifested 2 weeks ago during Laylatul Qadr, when hundreds and hundreds of Palestinians were not allowed to entry into Al-Aqsa Mosque, and buses of Palestinians were not allowed entry into Al-Aqsa Mosque. And so many hundreds of Jerusalemites came on their cars, even on their motorcycles, to transfer those Palestinians, which in turn blocked the traffic until the Israeli occupation authorities allowed entry. We also saw this unilateral, non-hierarchical, leaderless unity all across occupied Palestine 48, in Al-Lid, in Haifa, in Jaffa, when Palestinians all around were protesting and actively destroying these colonial fragmentations. So it's been the defiance of the Palestinian people, not just the resilience of the Palestinian people, but the absolute defiance, the absolute clinginess onto our right to protect our families and our communities, and onto our right to resist the occupation has been absolutely astounding and beautiful to witness, especially as a young person, especially as a person who's been fed for decades, 2 decades now, over 2 decades, that the occupation is invincible, that the Israeli regime has no flaws, and that we are minuscule. And while we are technically the victims in this equation, and we are going up a nuclear superpower, one that has many international alliances that are fascist within their own right, we are also seeing that we are a good opponent. And that's been heartwarming to see in Sheikh Jarrah. It's been heartwarming to see in Led, in even Gaza, all over the place. We are learning today that people are more likely to be in solidarity and allyship with you when it is stemming out of victory rather than victimhood. I want to also add that I'm very excited by all of the international campaigns, all of the international protests, all of the calls on internationalist trade unions, all of the artists circulating letters against Israeli apartheid, all of the people pushing for sanctions, all of the people rallying and marching to the Israeli embassies and consulates. We are finally in a moment, I believe, where the Palestinian struggle for liberation is mainstream. You know, we go back and forth between the mainstream, but the difference, and I talked to my friend Sumaya Awad, who's also a Palestinian writer and activist, and she said that the difference now, we're not just we're not just breaking through the mainstream for human rights violations. We're breaking through the mainstream as a liberationist movement. Our vocabulary of settler colonialism, our vocabulary that we have always used in the Palestinian street in Arabic is finally turning the tide, making it into the English and closing the chasm that once existed. Now, I believe that chasm existed because our leadership, our elders were, taught that we needed to appeal to the Western audiences. And so we presented ourselves in a way that didn't necessarily reflect the wishes of the Palestinian street. But today, because of the power of youth, because of the power of social media, because of our ability to escape the gatekeeping of mainstream media, the gatekeeping of NGOs, we are able to implement a new narration, a new rhetoric of Palestinian liberation that makes this so-called conflict way easier to understand. When you're presenting people the correct terminologies that reflect the truth, when people are looking at Sheikh Jarrah and hearing me and my family and the community members talk about it as colonialism and they see it happen in actuality, it's way more easy to understand for them than just saying that this is some kind of eviction and a legal battle and blah, blah, blah. Now, the challenges we are presented with are making sure that this is not a one thing story, because not only Sheikh Jarrah is experiencing this colonial fragmentation, experiencing dispossession and ethnic cleansing, but also just up the street from Sheikh Jarrah, Kubbaniyat Imharon, down a little bit 5 minutes away, Silwan, Al Isawiyah, all over Palestine. Every single place whose Palestinian identity is still intact is experiencing the imminent threat of Zionist colonialism, is experiencing the imminent threat of forced expulsion or theft, land theft, like for example in the South Hebron Hills, where people's ancestral lands, people's grazing lands are being declared as military zones and closed off from them. Another challenge we are faced with is being able to maintain this momentum globally. And I think once people are in allyship with us because they believe in our right to liberation, in our right to live on our lands, in our rights to live in dignity on our lands and have our own self-articulations and determine the future of our children, then I believe this momentum can continue until Israeli colonialism in Palestine is entirely dismantled. So I think it's time for all of us who are working in advocacy for Palestine to reaffirm and look into our language that we use and make sure we are highlighting the Palestinians' plight for liberation, not just the abuses that Palestinians are enduring. There are pictures to show that. But when I'm given airtime, I will say that I want to be liberated, that I want my family, my friends, my loved ones, my city, my country, my homeland to be liberated. And I think that's why armies of people are joining our side of history and joining the right side of history. I know I rambled, so I just want to say thank you. Please keep Sheikh Jarrah in your praxis as well as your prayers, and keep doing the good work. I think the narrative is shifting and things are changing. We just need to be patient and stubborn. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Muhammad. Not a rant at all. We are very thankful for you to be here and to speak to us, and for putting it in context in terms of our responsibility as the labor movement here outside of Palestine towards contributing to the liberation struggle for Palestinians, of course. So thank you so much. Next, I have the pleasure to introduce Budur Hassan, a Palestinian writer and legal researcher for Jerusalem Center of Legal Aid and Human Rights. And Budur will speak to the historic moment and what it tells us about the question of liberation for Palestine. So I'll hand it to you, Budur. Thank you so much for being with us.
You can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. So I will start where Muhammad has left off. It's always nice to speak after Muhammad, although he leaves us with very little to say, because it's always going to be downhill after his always moving speeches and presentations. But I'll try nonetheless. Before his martyrdom in 2017, and before he went into hiding, Basil al-A'raj, an engaged Palestinian intellectual, a dear friend, and one of the most fluent and articulate narrators of the Palestinian experience, and a friend and a teacher also, always maintained that resistance is an ongoing value, has an ongoing value, an ongoing worth. By that, he meant that even if we don't reap the rewards of resistance in our lifetime, it will accumulate and it will help our children, our grandchildren, reap the rewards of what we did, because it's always on the shoulders of those people before us that we carry on our struggles. He used memories of the great revolutions of the 1930s, of our long struggle against British colonialism and Zionism, and after that, after the establishment of the State of Israel, on our ruins, on our displacement, on the backs of our great-grandparents, that resistance continued. Sometimes during the past few months, these words of Basil, although they always rang very strong, sounded a bit hollow. We always wondered, okay, Basil, but we can't see that there is anything happening on. It's just so depressing all over the place. All these negotiations and deals, normalization deals between Arab regimes and between the so-called State of Israel. All these acknowledgements of Israel, all these presents. Again, we see the reincarnation of the Balfour Declaration. We saw it being implemented by Donald Trump. We see that there is no difference between liberals, conservatives, when it comes to Palestine globally. They always take the side of Israel. And it can be depressing, just feeling that nothing's going on and all these sacrifices have gone to waste. But then something probably unpredictable for some happens. One stone is thrown, one rock is thrown, and a river flows. And suddenly we remember Basil's words again, that resistance is not something that happens in a day or in a moment, but it builds on what happens before. It builds on an accumulation. And this is what the current moment is teaching us, be it in Jerusalem, in Sheikh Jarrah. And I speak particularly of Jerusalem, because for some, it might sound like a separate moment, what's been going on during the last few months in Sheikh Jarrah. But this moment in Sheikh Jarrah is directly related to another moment that happened in 2017, when also crowds of people, thousands and thousands of people, thanks to their sit-in, thanks to their struggle, managed to force Israel into removing their metal detectors outside of Al-Aqsa Mosque. These two moments in 2017, when the people stormed into Al-Aqsa Mosque, chanting and singing and holding hands, was reminiscent of what we saw also in 2021, just a month ago, when the youngsters of Jerusalem forced Israeli police into withdrawing from Damascus Gate. And with their bare hands, they removed the barricades that Israel had installed outside Damascus Gate, the steps of the Damascus Gate, their beloved space. It is the very space that Israel has renamed after two Israeli soldiers. But even these attempts of symbolic erasure as well as physical erasure, in 1 second, they evaporated because of the will of these young women and men. And these people who in Ellison's word, the writer of Invisible Man, were left outside of history. They suddenly said, we can no longer be witnessed outside of history. We're reclaiming our history. And these two moments in 2017 and 21 also feed off another moment in 2014, when again Palestinians also protested and rebelled after the burning to death of Muhammad Abu Khdeir in Shu'afat, and when they also protested and declared civil disobedience against Israel. So all this is an accumulation that has been going on in Jerusalem. Even during the moments of quiet, we keep telling people, don't think that there is a quiet. There can never be quiet under colonialism. There can never be, not relative, not because or unrelative, really. There is always something going on, because as long as there is oppression, people will fight to end it. Sometimes it can be invisible, these resistance. It can take the form of everyday resistance. Sometimes it can sound totally futile and totally hidden, because people are also tired. After 73 years of continuing everyday ethnic cleansing and of attempts at erasure, we can't deny that, yes, there is exhaustion. Yes, there are some who are inured to our suffering and inured to our struggle. But at the same time, these new generations, generation after generation, keep renewing the struggle. And this is exactly what we're seeing now, not just in Jerusalem, not just in Gaza, where also this tireless struggle for freedom, for dignity, is something that keeps inspiring us. Despite all the grief that we're seeing in Gaza, despite all the heartbreak, despite all, sometimes when a war breaks in Gaza, usually in the past, we used to have this feeling of impotence, of we can't do anything for them because they are bombarded from the sky and from everywhere. And we're just there, we're on the same land, but because we are divided and we are isolated from them, we can't help, we can only pray or share the news or do something that sounds totally impotent. This is the first time probably that every Palestinian felt that she can do something concrete for Gaza, that by being on the street, by declaring, participating in the national strike on Tuesday that reunited all of Palestine from the river to the sea, we're actually disrupting the colonial machine. We're actually saying that our blood, the blood that is spilling on the ground on Gaza, is not cheap. It's worth the entirety of the universe. And this is what people in all of Palestine said when they protested on Tuesday, when they connected the dots and said that the struggle in Gaza and the struggle in Jerusalem, all of Jerusalem's neighborhood, and the struggles in all of the cities of historic Palestine is one struggle. When we chanted our martyr's name, when we said that Gaza, we're with you till victory. And this is what we felt. We felt that we can actually help our people, our sisters and brothers in Gaza, probably for the first time. I'll just give a few glimpses of what it means to be Palestinian during these last couple of months in particular, to just exemplify why I do think this is an historic moment. When I see a kid who's just barely 14 lose his eye because Israeli police shot him in the eye, a kid from Shfa'amer, which is a Palestinian town in the territories occupied in 1948. This kid is deprived of learning his own history in schools because Israel denies Palestinians the right to study their own history or their own geography. He studies in a civics book called How to be a Citizen of Israel, right? And after he studies in this book, because this curriculum is imposed on him, he goes to a protest and Israeli police shoots him in the eye. Apparently, according to Israel, this is how to be a citizen of Israel. Because when you are Palestinian, you are shot in the eye, you're targeted. He loses his eye, he's 14, and he says, I'm ready to sacrifice my other eye for Palestine, for Jerusalem, for Gaza. No one taught him to say that. It was something that came directly out of his heart. When I see another kids who are brutalized by the police, and much of the brutalization that Palestinian boys and girls and women and men are facing are not taped and are not photographed. What we see in the cameras or photographs is just a tiny, tiny minority or a tiny fraction of what's actually going on. And these kids, even after they are beaten by the police and beaten by the musta'aribin, who are the undercover police who pretend to be Arabs in order to kidnap Palestinian protesters, especially the young, as a form of intimidation. And when I see these kids return to the demonstration, bruised and almost beaten, but not broken, and I see this is fourth generation to the Nakba. The great-grandparents of these kids were ethnically cleansed in 1948, or by a fraction of coincidence, they survived and stayed on their land in 1948. After 1948, they were forced to live under a military rule in what became known as Israel. But for these great-grandparents always remained Palestine. And their children, grandchildren, and their own children continue acknowledging that this is Palestine by waving the Palestinian flag, by going in protests, by challenging the machine of Israeli oppression. And this gives us hope. Not only does this give us hope, it also tells us that it's impossible for us to lose faith in this generation, that any loss of faith is not only a betrayal to the cause, but it's actually lack of humility, because this generation that has been written down, these young women and men, many of them are teenagers, are doing so many things that my generation probably didn't have the courage to do. And they're redefining the Palestinian struggle. They don't use, as Muhammad said, they don't use the vocabulary of human rights and international law, because they actually saw on their flesh, on their skin, and on the bruised bones that this vocabulary, this discourse has done nothing, has only cemented and reinforced their oppression. They are using the language of liberation. They're re-articulating their courage. In Edward Said word, they're not waiting for anyone's permission to narrate their story. They're snatching the right to narrate from the jaws of a machine that has long tried to silence us and has long tried to prevent us from speaking up, and that has long tried to demonize any attempt of Palestinians to speak up. These people also, in James Baldwin's words, are creating a new future. Probably this future for them, or the shape of this future, is not clear yet, but they do know that this future belongs to them. And this is not just a cliche. This is exactly what we're seeing when we're seeing these young women and men removing the metal detectors, or removing the barricades, or participating in a strike despite Israel's threats to fire them from their jobs, or to threaten them, or to arrest them, or to intimidate them. And this is a historic moment, but it's impossible, and it's prohibited to let it slip. The dust of the war will settle, and some people will go back to business as usual. But for Palestinians, it's never business as usual. And we cannot afford to go back to business as usual. Why? Because while we're still in the thick of our battle in Sheikh Jarrah and in Jerusalem, and also in Palestine 48, we expect that the reprisals of Israel will be brutal. We expect, and we are already seeing, mass waves of arrest all over Palestine. We expect that the blockade on Gaza will continue, and that there will be attempts and collisions between Israel and Arab regimes in order to defeat Gaza, to break Gaza after they failed to break it after so many numerous wars. We will see that Israel's project to domesticate the Palestinian people, to erase our identity, will continue. We will see how Israel will keep funding these centers aimed at eradicating our identity. And this is why it's so important. This solidarity is important during the times of so-called relative quiet, even more important than just now, because now everyone is giving attention and it's so important. But it's important to support people when they are arrested en masse and when no one is paying attention. It's important to support people when Israel is taking revenge and no one is paying attention. It's important to keep the cause going and to keep talking about Palestine and mobilizing for Palestine when so few people are paying attention. And finally, I would just say something, that our struggle in Palestine, as you all stated and reiterated, is part of a larger struggle against so many different regimes of domination and of oppression. It's part of the larger struggle against patriarchy, colonialism, and capitalism. It's part of a larger struggle for liberation for everyone. And just as we saw how movements, how decolonial movement, abolitionist movement, Black liberation movement in the United States, in Africa, and indigenous struggles in Latin America have always supported us, and we have learned so many things of them. I just want to send a message of solidarity to our sisters and brothers fighting the neoliberal extractivist regime and Colombia manifested in Uribe, and the unconditional support it's receiving from the United States. And also a big message of love, solidarity, and appreciation to our Indigenous sisters and brothers in so-called Canada for everything they have struggled and for teaching us so many things about what it means to be resilient and what it means to never give up. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Budur. This was Budur Hassan, a Palestinian writer and legal researcher from Jerusalem. Powerful words, Budur. Thank you. You're an inspiration to all of us in the diaspora and to the new generation taking up the struggle in Palestine. As you mentioned, and in the words of Edward Said, we are not waiting and we will not wait for anyone else to narrate our story for us. We cannot afford for business to go as usual, and us here in the labor movement in Canada, we will make sure that business is not continuing as usual with apartheid Israel until Palestine is liberated and free. We are going to take a 2-minute break just for our interpreter, Noel, who's doing an amazing job. Thank you, to take a sip of water, and we will view a short video during this time. Please stay with us. And we will be back with Riham Abu Aita and Jamal Jum'a to continue on this wonderful and very powerful panel. Thank you.
الجلال والجمال والثناء والبهاء في رباع والحياة والنجاة والهناء والرجاء في هواء في هواء.
Thank you again for joining us back on this important panel, Labor Solidarity and Palestinian Resistance. It is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Riham Abu Aita. Riham, Palestinian journalist and communications expert and an active member of the Palestinian Journalists Union. Riham will be speaking on the attacks on journalists that we have seen and the impunity for the attackers, which remains unaddressed. She will also speak to us about the challenges faced by Palestinian journalists and activists in terms of freedom of expression. Thank you so much, Riham, for making the time to be with us today.
Thank you very much for everyone. Thank you, Yafa, for the introduction as well. I will be focusing on freedom of expression in Palestine and Israeli occupation violations against journalists and media outlets here. I would start by saying that this latest brutal aggression by the Israeli occupation against Palestinian journalists was more challenging for us as Palestinian journalists and activists in terms of freedom of expression, because we faced additional suppression on virtual space in parallel with attacks on the grounds. On 19th of May, we lost our colleague from Gaza, Yusuf Abu Hussein. His name was added to the list of 20 journalists murdered by occupation forces with full impunity. Moreover, in the last 2 weeks, the Palestinian Journalists Union documented more than 200 violations against journalists and media outlets, including physical attacks on 170 journalists and destroying the offices of at least 33 international and local media outlets in Gaza. Yesterday, journalists in Jerusalem, severely beaten by batons and prevented from covering near Al-Aqsa Mosque. On virtual space, more than 500 reports of Palestinian digital rights violations were documented with the support of the public and civil society in the period from 6th to 19th of May. The violation included content and accounts were removed, reduced, and restricted. Hashtags were hidden, and archived content deleted. 50% of these reports were about Instagram, 35% Facebook, and 11% on Twitter. It's also worth to mention that these violations are part of systemic targeting of media in Palestine. Every year, we documenting hundreds of violations against journalists and media outlets. For example, last year, the Palestinian Journalists Union documented 490 violations, including 12 serious physical injuries with bullets and gas grenades. Away from numbers, you can't imagine the working environment and stress for journalists who covered the recent events, especially the aggression on Gaza. They went to the field to cover the occupation aggression with fear to be targeted, with greater fear to lose their family and friends. They were not beside their families in the hardest moments of bombing and shelling. They chose to speak about the injustice and crimes against the people. They took footages for their offices being destroyed with rockets. We saw them crying while standing on the roof of their offices. We saw them crying during the funeral of their colleague. But all of this did not stop them from continuing reporting. I will quote from journalist Faris Al-Ghul, who told me, "I was terrified to lose my family, especially my 3 daughters and wife. My office was totally destroyed by the occupation along with many media offices. When I arrived there and saw all the building on the ground, I started to cry. It was the hardest moment ever. This injustice must stop. Freedom of expression for Palestinians should be granted, not only for media, but for every single person. We believe that unions and journalists around the world could do much more to stand with Palestinian journalists. For that, we were in constant contact with International Federation of Journalists to update them on regular basis and to plan for actions. We participated in sessions with labor unions in UK. We sent letters to all member states before participating in the UN 75th session on Palestine and Israel, calling them to mention freedom of expression during their speeches. Representatives of Canada, France, Australia, and Albania did less. The violence against journalists is completely unacceptable, Canada's representative said in his speech. It could to address this plight of journalists in the UN sessions, but what we hope to see is to hold the occupation accountable for these crimes. We want to see sanctions. We want to see suspension of trades of all arms, because with impunity, without consequences, without punishments, Israeli occupation will continue with his acts, which is against international law that guarantees freedom of expression. Labor union in Canada, including Canadian Journalists Union, also must ensure the right of Canadian citizens and media to express their solidarity with Palestinians and to report freely without any restrictions and pressure. To give you an example, Dr. Valentina Azarova paid high price for expressing her solidarity with Palestine. University of Toronto withdrew a job offer for Azarova as International Human Rights Law Program Director. Amnesty International responded by suspending its relation with the university. Another example from Canadian newsrooms, 2 journalists from Canada's national broadcaster said that they have been barred from covering news about Palestine and Israel after signing an open letter criticizing coverage of Israeli occupation attacks against Gaza and calling for more fair coverage. This letter was signed by more than 2,000 people, including journalists and writers in Canada and US. We demand labor unions in Canada to closely follow up all these cases and put pressure on Canadian media to give more space for Palestinian voices. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Riham, for this very important intervention and for spotting light on the systemic attack on Palestinian journalists, but also for those outspoken about Palestine liberation and Palestinian rights outside of Palestine. I have the pleasure now to introduce our final speaker, Jamal Jum'a, Executive Committee member of the Palestine New Federation of Trade Unions and Secretariat member of the Boycott National Committee. Jamal Jum'a will also, in a very timely manner, we received today a call from Palestinian trade unions calling for immediate and urgent action from international trade unions. It is my pleasure to introduce Jamal. Jamal, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Yafa. Thanks also for Muhammad, Wudur, and Riham for the excellent presentations that they gave us. You know, these days the Palestinian people everywhere around the world are celebrating the victory of the Palestinian resistance. Yes, it's a victory of our people who are occupied and besieged on Israel, the cornerstone of imperialism in the region. You know, the uprising that we had in a month is not just a result of what's happening in Jerusalem or in Jordan Valley. We are talking about 73 years of the Nakba, 73 years of racism and racial discrimination against 1.5 million of our people in the Israeli regime, and the identity, de-developing their villages and marginalizing them. This is happening in what's so-called the only democracy in the Middle East, how they introduce themselves. We are talking about 73 years of alienation of 6 million Palestinian refugees around the world that denied their right of homeland. We are talking about 54 years of the occupation of West Bank and Gaza Strip in 1967. 50 years of colonizing of our land, oppression, humiliation, ripping of our hope and our land, demoralization, killing of our people, massacre after another, imprisoning our people, destroying our homes and communities, ghettoizing apartheid policies, and suppression of freedom of our people, over
Jamal,
over
can I
5,000.
just a quick note, the interpreter is finding it a bit fast and the mic is not picking up everything you're saying. So just a little bit more slowly so we can hear you properly. Thank you. Shukran.
Yeah. So I was talking about the 50 years of the occupation in the West Bank and Gaza Strip in 67. Talking about 50 years of colonization of our land, oppression, humiliation, ripping our hope and our land, demoralization of people, killing, massacre after another, all the prolonged of the occupation, imprisoned in homeland, other than the prison that has more than 5,000 people or Palestinians in the jails. Over 1 million people, Palestinian people, have been imprisoned since 1967. All this that I'm talking about are tools of the Zionist settler-colonial regime to destroy our people and its resistance, and suffocating us in an apartheid system and indigenous reservation as marginalized minority people, like what happened in indigenous communities around the world, especially in so-called United States and Canada, Australia, and others. In 2017, when Trump came to the power, Israel thought that this is the time to knock out and liquidate Palestine cause. And this was on two levels. First, to hit the principles that we were struggling for since the Nakba, which is started by recognizing Jerusalem as a capital of Israel, targeting the UNRWA. By targeting the UNRWA, they targeted also the refugees problem, which is one of the main core of our struggle in our life. 70% of our people are refugees. And legalizing the colonies, again, that's against the international law, and recognizing also the sovereignty of Israel on Syrian Golan Heights. The second important thing that they do along with that is isolating and strike the edge of our struggle by association with some Arab countries, which they were aiming that they will continue in doing this, and in a way to quibble, and we are defeated. As part of the annexation plan, at the beginning of this year, the ethnic cleansing in Jordan Valley, where they're targeting the Bedouin communities. Hamsa is a big Bedouin community that's destroyed from January until end of February 6 times, and it's still under military blockades. People there smuggling the water for themselves, smuggling the fodder for their animals, and they are still fasting there. Like Al Khan al-Ahmar, like a few years ago, if they succeed to destroy Khan al-Ahmar, go for another 42 Bedouin communities in that area that will be destroyed after. Homsa also is the same. They started with a big Bedouin community. If they succeed to do that, they will go on for another 9 Bedouin communities.
Jamal, sorry to interrupt again. Your voice, your audio is cutting off quite a bit. Perhaps if you turn off your video, the quality might get better. Try that.
Talked a lot about it. Is that okay now? Maybe it's better?
Yeah, I think it's better now. Sorry,
I was
Jamal.
saying that بسيطة. I said that in Jerusalem they chose Ramadan month to open this that's what they called it, last fight for Jerusalem. They wanted totally the Palestinians to surrender for all their sovereignty and controlling Jerusalem. And they start, as you know, with Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan. Silwan, there is 3 main neighborhoods in Silwan are threatened of destruction as well. Besides also the attack on Al-Aqsa. But why Ramadan? Why they choose Ramadan? They think because Ramadan, Jerusalem usually in Ramadan and Al-Aqsa Mosque became full of Palestinian people, not just from Jerusalem, but from all over. So if they think, if they feel with this mass in people in Jerusalem, they were able to do that, it means that they succeed, especially after the fire they called the electronic gates that they were trying, and they defeated that time. And Jerusalem, as I was explaining, it's totally surprising, not just the world, but also the patient and all their expectation from them. A month where people in the streets, from Sheikh Jarrah to Bab al-Amud to Al-Aqsa Mosque, where like it's inspired all the Palestinians around the world, around in the West Bank, in Gaza, and as well. So we start witnessing demonstrations with the Quds everywhere. In West Bank started to erupt demonstrations on the confrontational points, and the main dimension added to that is the 48, which is this is the last thing that Israel were expecting to be this. So finally, and at once became all the Palestinian people united. Then it came the other dimension in Gaza engaged in this as a response to what's going on in Al-Aqsa, where they're warning Israel. What's the result of this, like on Israel itself, and how it is like, and we called it as a victory. For the first time in Israel, 4 million Israelis were in the shelters. Airports has been closed, their economy paralyzed. And it's not just Gaza, but demonstrations going on everywhere in Palestine, as well as the international wide. Yes, it's true, the price was, we are talking about 18,000 housing unit height, including 5 towers, and 16,800 houses that have serious damages. 50 factories has been destroyed, 74 public institutions, 60 schools destroyed. Huge damage they did in the infrastructure, water network, electricity, and roads, which create over 40,000 Palestinian refugees in the UNRWA school. It's clearly that they were trying to revenge from the civilians in order to hijack everything. In fact, they use it as a pressure on the Palestinian resistance to stop and to surrender. And in spite of all this, and we call it a big victory because it really marks a new era of our resistance on different levels. First, we talk about the strength and the spirit of the Palestinian the resistance. It came back again out of, it's abolished the whole frustration that people were were feeling in the last few years. Secondly, it shows and united the Palestinian people and shows that 73 years of racism, fragmentation of the Palestinians didn't work. And this is one of the main things that they were working from 48 up to now, is to fragment these people, to kill any possibility of a unified resistance. The third thing is obstructed the Judaization project in Jerusalem. I think will become much more difficult to continue the way they continue in Jerusalem. The other thing in the West Bank and Jerusalem as well, I think it's failed the deal of the century. It's not any more thing that they can talk about it. And the fifth is it's obstructed the normalization of the Arab countries. We see hundreds of thousands of the Arabs in the streets, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Morocco, in Tunisia, in Algeria. It's just waking up and bring back the life of and the hope within the people in the region after all this normalization and the pressure that the people have. It's also strengthening the international solidarity. Like this, for the first time, we see millions of people in the streets everywhere. And particularly, I think the most interesting one is what's happening in the United States. And this is one of the things, by the way, that was behind Biden pressuring Israel to stop the war. He was telling Netanyahu clearly, you are losing the street in United States, and we can't afford that. The sixth dimension, I think, is it's restored the consideration of the Palestinian cause and it placed it again on the table of the decision makers, not just in the region, but as well in the United States of America. And I think this will bring back the importance and the whole move around the Palestinian issue, trying to solve that. The other important thing, I think, that people now in the West Bank and Jerusalem, feel that they are backed up. There's, especially after Gaza engaged and support the Jerusalemites in their struggle. Now we feel that Palestinians feel that in anything that happened in the West Bank and Jerusalem, we will have somebody to respond, and Israel will be very careful from having another escalation like what's happened, or another intifada like what happened. That's all good. That's all great. But I think one of the main things and the challenge that we have now is how we can maintain this and build on it. And I think we have on different levels. I think nationally, we need to enforce the unity of our people and restoring the PLO and the new bases. This is the way. We have to include all the Palestinian forces, popular movements, 48, people in the diaspora. And I think the elections should be the way to go on with this. The second thing is to put an end to the Oslo humiliating agreements. That makes the Palestinian PA as an agent, for the occupation, and we have to talk about it. They have to stop the security coordination and other coordination that totally humiliating the Palestinian people. The other thing that we need to create a kind of united leadership in order to reinforce the popular resistance in West Bank and Jerusalem. Regionally, in order to maintain what's happening, I think it's opened a way for us, and that's what we should do, is continue connecting and networking with the progressive movements and civil society in the Arab world. We need to expand and support the BDS and anti-normalization committees in the Arab countries. We have to build on this, and this is our hope to have the change in the Arab world. Internationally, BDS. BDS is the answer. BDS is the one who's worrying Israel. BDS is the one that all the people around the world can do. We need to go on with BDS on all sides. Trade unions, I think they should have a very significant role in this. The other thing, I think we need to think as a Palestinians how we can put more efforts in the United States. I think mainly, I'm not talking about the government, but I'm talking mainly about people, movement, movements and how we can strengthen our relation, and how can we build in a continuous support there that can has influence in the street first, and also after that in the parliament. We saw that there's a little shifting that's going on within the politician, the parties there, that we have to use and to focus on. This is in general. If there is any questions, I'm ready to answer, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Jamal, for this extremely helpful intervention. Before I pass it on to my sister, Amy Kishek, to invite our panelists to just make quickly closing remarks. And just on this point, Jamal, especially that we're hosting this from Canada, and we know that Canada's role is also complicit in terms of weapon sales to Israel. So we do have a responsibility as the labor movement to address these issues. But there is a question that one of the audience members posted, and I think one that we receive quite a bit from the labor context. And the question is, if you could just quickly respond to this one. Are there freely organized labor unions in the occupied West Bank, in besieged Gaza? Do they negotiate collective agreements with Israeli employers or with Palestinian employers? And what percentage of Palestinian workers are organized in labor unions?
And this is too much about the labor movement and what's happening, either in the Israeli factories or even in the Palestinian ones. But the main thing that we are suffering from is that the main trade unions that we have in Palestine, the BGFTU, have an agreement, they signed an agreement with the Histadrut, the Israeli labor organization, which is a Zionist labor organization there that has been working against the Palestinian rights, the workers' rights in 48. This is one of our struggles in the new union and other independent unions. Our problem with this is
sorry, interpreter is just asking, sorry, Jamal, for another interruption, just asking to slow down just for interpretation. Go ahead.
I'm saying that that one of our main challenges for the Palestinian labor is that our main labor organization, which belonging to the PLO and the political parties, mainly is signing an agreement with the Histadrut, and they are blocking in a way, and the BDS trying to block the BDS with the Israelis internationally. And they didn't do their job that as we expected, and they should do, defending the workers' rights inside there. In fact, there is, unfortunately, when they signed the agreement, the Histadrut used to deduct 1% of the workers' wages, which is accumulated since '67 to hundreds of millions of shekels that they divided between each other, and they're still deducting 1% of the Palestinian wages. That goes half to the Israeli one and half to the Palestinian. This is shameful, I would say. This is illegal to do that, but they are still doing without a real noticeable work for the benefit of the workers. I think Gaza, the situation in Gaza is worse. But the other thing that I was talking about for the interruption is that our main problem as progressive labor organizations here, and independent ones, and in the union, is our voice is not heard in the international labor organizations. They only recognize the official one, and this is a struggle. We are going to continue our struggle. We are following the cases of the Palestinian workers in 48. We have hundreds, if not thousands, of cases in the Israeli courts as well, because we can't bring this court cases to the Palestinian courts, and doesn't work in this issue. We internally as well within the Palestinian labor market and the factories, we were working on establishing workers' committees there, and also demanding so many things from the Palestinian Authority And first of all is the minimum wages to be approved and to be forced on the businessmen and in the factories. The other things is to have courts, special courts for the workers' rights. Some workers' cases in the Palestinian courts can last for 15 years without any solution. The main important, I think, that we are demanding is to hear the voice of the independent and progressive labor movement. It's growing. It's became bigger and bigger. We see the frustration of the workers from what's happening in the main organization, and this needs to be supported internationally. Internationally, these forces has to be recognized and have to be supported. We are calling for boycotting the Israeli labor organization, the Histadrut. We are calling the international labor organizations around the world to play a very important role in supporting the BDS as one of the main tools to support the Palestinian rights and the Palestinian independence.
Thank you so much, Jamal, and all our speakers. And I have now my sister Amy Kishik. I just want to point out that our speaker today, Mohammed Al-Kurd, just sent us a quick voice message informing us that the Israeli occupation forces just raided his house, his family house in Jerusalem, and that's why we lost him. So the Israeli soldiers are currently invading his house in Jerusalem. To you, Amy.
I wanted to take a moment to offer our panelists the chance to give some closing thoughts. We are going to leave folks with some calls to action, but I wanted to give, and we do have a number of questions that we won't be able to get to, but there is one that we did receive that I think would be a good way to sort of frame the final moments of the discussion. So if we can get everyone maybe back on camera, if they can, from our speakers. The question we got asks, in your struggle against Israel as an apartheid and brutal colonial state, how do you foresee Palestine free of Israeli aggression and brutality, and what forms of struggle are available to you? I think that sort of is a bit of a nice general statement that maybe we can work from to leave people with something about what they can take away. I think you've given us a lot to think about and a lot of work that we can do. And I think just final thoughts that you have around how we can support you in that struggle. Yeah, we'd welcome your thoughts.
So Budud, if you want to go, not in any particular order.
And it can be on something else. We also got questions around how can we link, for example, the decolonization movement in Canada with the Palestinian movement and that concept of land back that's being really in the fore now in Canada. We've also had some questions around the best methods for advocating for BDS and getting an active boycott campaign through social media. How do you see that playing out? So just some ideas for you. Our audience certainly has a lot of really insightful questions and are looking to do more, it seems, which is great.
I think all of these are very important questions, obviously, which warrant another meeting probably soon. I just obviously now our heart goes to Muhammad and to our families in Sheikh Jarrah, who've over the past since 2008 have always hosted us and embraced us despite all that they had faced. So it's kind of difficult to think of anything nuanced to say when you are this concerned, but I guess it's what it's like to live under occupation. I think every one of us has a different vision of what a free Palestine will look like and what liberation will look like. And this is why my note will be very personal. It will be something that I dream of And it's how I imagine, or I want to imagine it, but I think it's something that we can achieve. It's not, we usually thought it's our grandchildren's turn to do that, but suddenly moved by all that's happening, not just senseless optimism, but rational hope also. That's perhaps our generation will live long enough to see that moment, or will at least pave the way for that moment to happen. We definitely dream, or many of us dream of a democratic, secular, free and equal country for everyone, regardless of religion, regardless of gender, regardless of affiliation. And it's something that we believe that is achievable. I definitely think personally that not only the two-state solution has died. I think it was never born in the first place to die at all. I think it's clear that this territory that stretches from the river to the sea it cannot be divided. And this is why it must be united on the principles of social justice, equality, but before everything, decolonization. Sorry, I'm quick. And decolonization means right of return for the refugees. And decolonization also after that means justice and means accountability. And means transitional justice that's not there only to please those who committed crime, but to actually do something real against those who committed crimes, because so many of the things that have been committed since 1948 cannot simply be forgotten or hidden. So I think these are the principles that dictate our struggle for a liberated Palestine for everyone, as I said, that is democratic, secular, and built on the principles of social justice and on the principle of refugee return. I think we have small movements that have been rethinking decolonization, both on so many levels, aesthetically, artistically, historically, legally, what it looks like. Sometimes we think it's probably too early, but in my opinion, it's always something that we should always think of, because it can be much sooner than we had previously expected. Just one sentence regarding what we can do as solidarity or as transnational solidarity. I know that transnational corporations and state are very good at oppressing all of us. They're very good at erasing borders in order to exploit us. So we always see these deals between transnational corporations to steal our lands for their extractivist projects, be it in Canada and the United States or in Latin America, be it by liberal, so-called liberal state, or by militaristic right-wing state. There is no difference when it comes to the principles of exploitation. One might say that even in liberal states, it's even worse, or so-called liberal states also. I think this is why we as people can also try to break these borders. We saw in many sit-ins against extractivism in Dakota, also in Canada, especially we saw in the struggle, the struggles of our sisters and brothers in Honduras, before and after the martyrdom of Berta Cáceres. We saw it also how these movements received support from all over the world. It's our duty to learn of their struggles. It's our duty to mark their struggles, to connect with them. I think during these times of pandemic, while there have been obviously many difficulties, one of the blessings in disguise is that we've been able to connect because of the ways we can connect online. Still, we can't reach out to many people, especially in rural communities that don't have internet, perhaps, or that we need to travel in order to reach them. But their message is reaching out. And I think understanding that the root cause of our oppression is one, and understanding that no place can achieve liberation on its own. It has to be something that's unifying all of us, and rethinking of new strategies and discussing that is really a great step, regardless of where we stand. I mean, regardless of what tactics we think of, because we can always disagree over tactics, and it's legitimate and it's important to disagree. But what we at least have in common, and should be our springboard, is we all agree on this need for decolonization and liberation, and can be our guiding principle.
Right on. I think that's a really powerful way to phrase it. And it addresses some of the questions we have, I think, around the shift here towards talking about anti-racism. That's always trying to be tempered into talking about equity and inclusion, which really take away that political sort of praxis that is actually what builds the solidarity, I think, across all of Indigenous people. And I think that's important to always come back to that. Rahem, if you have any closing thoughts, we'd welcome that.
Rahem, I think you muted.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I really agree with Budur of what we are dreaming, because after all these years of occupation, we will not accept anything that we don't, a state that we don't feel comfortable, and we don't feel equal, and we don't feel like we get all our rights. We are fighting to live in dignity and with full human rights. So I think I dream of this state where all Palestinians lives equally, with no discrimination, with no attacks, with no human rights violations. And I think we can do that. We can do it, sorry. And we can build this state, because all of these years, we learned to not be silent. We learned to not be suppressed and do not do any reaction. So I think we can guarantee this state that we are dreaming of after getting rid of this occupation.
Beautiful, thank you. And Jamal, Yafa has a question in the chat for you. I don't know if you've seen it. Can you talk about the call to action this morning to trade unions internationally, and maybe tell us a little bit about dock workers in South Africa and Italy who are taking up solidarity? This is a question that we received, and I think people are very curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes, thank you, Amy. I think I want also to talk about to ask to use the momentum now, either in Canada or else in the world, to expand and to enlarge our communication with the different groups, political parties, in order to expand the base of the BDS committees and around the world. Now is the time to use it, especially also that there is human rights organizations like B'Tselem, like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty. I think it will follow this month, that they were calling the things in its name. Israel is an apartheid colonial regime, that we have to deal with it as that. We have to delegitimize them based on this, their apartheid, their occupation, racism. There is campaigns that has been launched, like Save Jarrah, Save Jerusalem, Save Hamsa, Save Jordan Valley, as well as also the call that has been sent out this morning by the Palestinian trade unions, that call for the international trade unions to act. It is the time now to act. Israel has been trading in military trade with different countries around the world. Here became the dock workers that started in Italy, started in South Africa. I think it has to be moved around in the United States and in England as well. the trade unions to joining and supporting the Palestinian struggle by also joining strongly the BDS. This is will support and the BDS movement. This is what we are really lacking. We still feel that there is still until now there is a kind of a weakness in this part. We need the trade unions to take a lead in supporting the Palestinian struggle.
Thank you so much, Jamal, Riham, Budur, and I just want to say reminder to everybody that our other speaker on this panel, Mohammed Al-Kurd, had to leave us suddenly because the Israeli soldiers have raided his home as he was on this panel. So he had to leave quickly. So we wish him safety and solidarity. This is a prime example how our lives are in Palestine under apartheid and occupation. Labor for Palestine, please follow them, follow us. Please keep an eye on the campaigns that we are taking. Right now, there's a post in the chat from Labor for Palestine to join the call for an arms embargo. Labor organizations, labor councils, and labor locals can sign this letter by Friday, May 28th. Please look it up. There's also, this is very timely as we in the labor movement in Canada have received this call specifically from the Palestinian trade unions call for an immediate and urgent action. And as we have heard from the speakers and have been talking about, we in Canada are complicit. The Canadian government is complicit. We are not just merely providing solidarity. There is a responsibility to act as well. So I'll pass it on to Amy for closing.
I want to thank everyone for taking the time to be with us. You can follow, we posted the links in the chat. We've launched a website that has the letter created by Labor for Palestine addressed to the Canadian government, demanding action on ending bilateral trade, arms trade, and related materials with the State of Israel. Canada does play a huge role in that trade and military relationship, and essentially is co-signing morally and making economically viable the oppression we see, the apartheid, the ethnic cleansing we see in Israel. You can find the letter at laborforpalestine.com, and we're hoping to get as many signatories as possible. And as we've been reminded today, it is very much the role of trade unions to take up this cause, to fight alongside Palestinian trade unionists and activists and keep building on this momentum. I want to thank all of our speakers who are with us today. I know that you've been here after, I'm sure, many, many days of telling your story to folks, I'm sure, around the world. That's very taxing, emotionally draining, and I know it takes a lot to be here and share that with us. We really appreciate it, and we'll certainly be taking up the causes as you've asked of us and sharing in the struggle with you. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you everyone who is with us here today.
And thank you for Noel for providing instant interpretation. Thank you so much. We know how difficult this job is, so thank you. And thank you everybody. Check out Labor for Palestine, get involved, get in touch if you have any questions. Let's get to work until Palestine and all of us are free.
Thanks everyone. Have a great day.
Have a great day.